By 8:10, the phone was finally quiet. He set it face down beside the keys, on the small table where receipts gathered without anyone meaning for them to. Outside, the nursing home parking lot held the last blue of dusk. A few cars were still there, their windows dull, their engines cooling. The old lunch cooler sat near his hand. It had gone with him through years of early trains and late returns, through mornings when the coffee was too hot and nights when he came home with the smell of metal and rain in his coat. Now it rested in this soft corner of the room, the part no one ever photographed. The family call had ended, but the room still held it. And for a moment, looking at that cooler, he could feel the ordinary ways people had tried to love him. He had sat in the nursing home parking lot longer than he meant to. Not long enough for anyone to wonder. Not long enough to become a thing. Just those few quiet minutes after visiting hours, when the front doors had slid closed behind him and the automatic light over the entrance kept shining on the same square of sidewalk. The sky had not gone dark all at once. It had thinned slowly, losing color over the tops of the parked cars, over the low brick building, over the flag near the walkway that barely moved in the evening air. Somewhere near the side entrance, a nurse stepped out for a breath, then went back in. A van idled near the curb. Its brake lights turned the pavement red for a moment and then went away. He stayed where he was. The old lunch cooler was on the passenger seat, dented near one corner, the handle worn smooth in the middle. It had been his for so long that he hardly saw it anymore. Blue once, maybe. Or gray. Time had made the color harder to name. The zipper still caught a little when it passed the seam, and there was a small place near the bottom where the fabric had darkened from years of being set down on station floors, break room counters, platforms, and the back steps of the house. Inside it, there was nothing important that night. An empty container. A napkin folded around crumbs. A bottle of water he had not finished. A receipt from a gas station on the edge of town. Still, he reached over and touched it before starting the car. That was how the day found him sometimes. Not through a large thought. Not through one clean feeling. Just his hand on an old thing, after a family call, after a visit, after the careful sentences people use when everyone is tired and no one wants to make the night heavier. The call had come before he left the parking space. His sister first, then his cousin patched in for a minute, then a voice message from his aunt that he did not play right away. They had talked about the room number, the new medication list, the nurse who seemed kind, the sweater left in the drawer, the small confusion over what day it was. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be held up as the whole story. Only family doing what family does. He had answered in the quiet voice he used on the train when a passenger was upset, when the delay was not his fault but still belonged to him for a little while. He knew how to keep his tone steady. He knew how to let someone finish. He knew how to stand in a narrow aisle while people looked to him for what came next. But after the call ended, there was no aisle, no announcement, no bell, no platform. There was only the parking lot. And the cooler. Later, back in the room, he set the phone face down because there was nothing left to say for a while. The small table near the wall had become the usual place for things that did not quite belong anywhere else. Keys. Receipts. A folded note from the nursing home. A pen that worked only when held at a certain angle. The old lunch cooler leaned against one table leg, as if it too had come in from the long day and needed to be left alone. The room had not changed much. That was the part that caught him. The same lamp. The same chair near the window. The same narrow space between the table and the wall where dust collected if nobody thought to look. The same quiet that always seemed to wait until everyone else was finished talking. He looked at the cooler, and another room came up inside this one. A kitchen from years ago. A lunch packed before sunrise. A paper towel wrapped around a sandwich. Someone rinsing grapes in a colander because that was what there was time for. Someone asking whether he had enough coffee, whether the weather would turn, whether the late train would put him home after midnight again. At the time, it had seemed like background. People asked small questions. People put food in bags. People left porch lights on. People saved receipts in case they were needed later. People stood at the counter and listened while the morning hurried everyone along. Years later, the ordinary parts had weight. Not a heavy weight. More like warmth that had been stored in plain things and waited until the room was quiet enough for him to feel it. The lunch cooler did not explain anything. It only sat there, scuffed and familiar, holding the shape of many days when somebody had tried to send him into the world with enough. He picked up the gas station receipt from the table and held it a little longer than he needed to. The numbers on it were fading already. The paper curled at the edge. It was nothing he needed to keep. Still, his hand did not let go right away. The receipt came from a place he hardly remembered stopping. A gas station outside the main road, probably. One of those bright little places with coffee that had been sitting too long, a rack of phone chargers near the register, and a cooler humming against the back wall. He could picture the clerk more from habit than memory. Someone looking tired under fluorescent light. Someone saying, "Have a good one," while already turning to the next person in line. He had folded the receipt once and put it in his shirt pocket without thinking. Now it was here. The small table held it the way small tables hold the end of a day. Not neatly. Not badly. Just honestly. The keys were half on top of a folded note from the nursing home. The phone lay dark, its screen turned toward the wood. A plastic pharmacy card had slipped under the edge of the cooler strap. The pen sat beside everything, still uncapped. Nothing was arranged for memory. That was why it felt true. The room did not try to look meaningful. The lamp had a little dust inside the shade. The chair near the wall had one arm worn smoother than the other. A jacket was hung over the back of it because he had been too tired to find the hook. Near the baseboard, a faint line showed where the table had always been. There were rooms like that, rooms that kept a person's habits without asking permission. He stood there a while before sitting down. The old lunch cooler stayed near his knee, close enough that he could see the small scratches in the zipper pull. He remembered buying it quickly, years ago, before an early run, because the other one had finally split open. He had not thought of it as anything special. It was a thing to carry food. A thing to keep ice packs cold. A thing to throw into the passenger seat before dawn. But so much of a life hides in the things bought quickly. A thermos. A uniform belt. A pack of gum. A road map that stayed in the glove box long after the phone knew every road. A cheap pair of gloves for winter platforms. The extra socks he kept in his bag because cold feet made a long shift longer. He knew the shape of ordinary preparation. He knew how a morning could begin before anyone else was ready for it. The alarm. The kitchen light. The small sound of the refrigerator opening. The quiet search for a lid that matched the container. Someone moving carefully because the house was still asleep. Someone wrapping food in foil, or writing a name on a paper bag, or sliding a note under a magnet on the fridge. There had been love in those movements. Not the kind that stopped the room. Not the kind that made speeches. A quieter kind. The kind that checked whether the lunch cooler was clean. The kind that put a napkin in even when nobody asked. The kind that noticed when a person was running out of time and poured the coffee anyway. He had missed so much of it when it was happening. Not because he had meant to. The train schedule had its own grip on the body. People needed him alert. Doors had to close. Tickets had to be checked. A delay had to be explained in a voice that did not carry irritation. He had spent years taking care of motion, watching platforms slide by, learning the faces of people who were late, worried, half awake, ready to be home. So many people were always going somewhere. And he had been going too. Out before sunrise. Back after dark. Through rain, heat, ice, cancellations, crowded cars, quiet cars, holiday luggage, lost gloves, forgotten coffee cups, babies crying near the door, teenagers laughing too loudly, older men sleeping with their chins down. The world had passed through his workday in small pieces, and he had learned how to stand steady inside it. At the end of those days, the cooler came home with him. Sometimes it was empty. Sometimes it held an apple bruised on one side, a spoon wrapped in a paper towel, a container he meant to wash but left until morning. Sometimes someone had already gone to bed by the time he set it on the counter. Sometimes there was still a light waiting. He did not call it gratitude then. It was just coming home. Now, at the edge of this day, with the nursing home still in his mind and the phone turned down beside the keys, that old coming home reached him differently. It did not ask him to feel better. It did not make the room brighter. It simply made one plain thing warmer than it had been a minute before. The receipt softened in his hand. He looked at the cooler again, and the room was less sharp. The room took its time settling. There were small sounds first. The lamp giving off a faint heat. The old refrigerator starting up in the other room. A car passing outside, then gone. Somewhere in the wall, the pipes made a little knock and then were still again. He sat without turning on the television. The silence after a family call was different from ordinary silence. It still had voices inside it. His sister's careful questions. His cousin saying he would come by Sunday if work let him. His aunt's message waiting unheard, the little red mark on the screen already making its own kind of request. The phone stayed face down. For years, he had answered sounds quickly. The radio at his hip. The chime over a closing door. A passenger calling from the next car. A conductor learns to hear what needs attention, even through noise. A conductor learns the difference between a normal rattle and something wrong in the wheels, between a tired complaint and real fear, between a person asking for help and a person only needing to be seen for a second. But in this room, at 8:10, nothing needed an answer yet. That felt almost strange. He looked toward the small table again. The cooler was not quite under it and not quite beside it. It had landed the way old work things land, close to the place where the hand lets go. Its side pressed against the table leg. The handle leaned forward. One corner folded in a little, as if it had carried enough and no longer felt the need to stand straight. He knew that feeling. Outside the window, the nursing home parking lot was no longer visible from this room, but it had not left him. He could still see the dusk over the parked cars. He could still feel the pause before he drove away. The building had held its lights the way such places do, bright in the halls, softer in the rooms, with people moving quietly because everyone there was carrying some version of waiting. Waiting for sleep. Waiting for a nurse. Waiting for family to call again. Waiting for someone to remember which sweater was theirs, which photograph belonged on the dresser, which name had been spoken a minute ago and then slipped out of reach. He had seen rooms like that before, though he had not always understood them. His work had taken him past towns and backyards and apartment buildings, past windows lit for dinner, past little crossings where someone's whole evening paused for the train to pass. He used to look out and see only distance. Now he saw rooms. A kitchen where someone wrapped a sandwich in wax paper. A hallway where someone left shoes by the door. A table where keys, mail, receipts, and worry gathered in the same small place every night. A chair that stayed in the corner for years because nobody had the heart to move it. The room around him had not changed much either. That was why the past could enter so easily. It did not have to open a locked door. It only had to touch what was already there. The lamp. The worn arm of the chair. The table with the faint ring from a coffee cup. The old cooler by his knee. He reached down and moved the cooler closer. Not far. Just enough that it was no longer partly hidden under the table. The zipper pull clicked softly against the metal tab. He placed one hand on the top and left it there. The fabric was cool at first. Then it warmed under his palm. He thought of hands that had done this before his own. Hands pressing the lid shut. Hands checking the zipper. Hands setting it near the door so he would not forget it. Hands not asking to be thanked, because the morning was already moving and somebody had to get to work. Love had often looked like that. A thing prepared before words were ready. A small container filled. A receipt kept. A key placed where it could be found in the dark. A call made even when nobody knew what to say. He did not feel overcome. The room did not change into something grand. He only sat there with his hand on the old cooler, while the day became less sharp around the edges. And in that small quiet, warmth arrived without asking to be named. He did not play the message right away. The phone was still turned down, its glass pressed toward the table, as if it too had been asked to rest. He could have picked it up. He could have listened to his aunt's voice, heard the familiar pause before she said his name, heard whatever small update she had thought to leave. But for a while, he let it stay quiet. There was a kind of care in not rushing every sound. He had learned that slowly. On the train, every bell and crackle and call had required him to move toward it. A question from car 3. A ticket machine not reading. A person standing too close to the edge of the platform. A door that would not seal. His body had been trained by interruption. Even at home, it stayed ready. For many years, after a late shift, he would sit down and still feel the train moving beneath him. The room would be still, but some part of him remained in motion. His ears kept listening. His hand reached for things that were no longer there. His eyes went to the clock before they went to the person speaking. That was hard to explain. Not painful exactly. Not something worth making large. Just the residue of being needed by strangers all day, then coming home to people who needed him in quieter ways. A question about tomorrow. A broken cabinet hinge. A bill on the counter. A child half asleep on the couch. Someone asking if he had eaten, and him saying yes, even when what he meant was, not really. The cooler had known those nights. It had come in under his arm, smelling faintly of coffee, train air, and the plastic liner inside. Sometimes he dropped it near the back door. Sometimes he set it on the small table and forgot it until morning. Sometimes someone else opened it, took out the container, rinsed it, left it upside down beside the sink without saying much about it. That kind of love can disappear into routine. It can pass through a house so often that nobody stops to look at it. A container washed. A note saved. A receipt placed under a magnet. A porch light left on because somebody was still out there, making their way back. He looked around the room again. Nothing here was arranged to impress anyone. The table stood in the part of the room no one photographed, half shadowed by the lamp, close to the wall, close to all the things people set down when they were finished being seen. The keys had a small ring of wear around the brass. The receipt had bent where his thumb kept holding it. The old cooler leaned there with its tired corner and stubborn zipper. It seemed to belong more than anything else. The nursing home had rooms like that too. Places not meant for pictures. The corner where extra blankets were folded. The tray table with a plastic cup, a comb, a paper calendar from a local insurance office. The chair where family members sat while trying to sound normal. The narrow dresser top where someone placed cough drops, framed photos, tissues, and a card from a church group or a neighbor. A life does not only live in beautiful places. Sometimes it lives in the places where things gather because people are trying. Not perfectly. Not with enough time. Not always with the right words. But trying all the same. He thought of the room he had visited earlier, how little had changed since the last time. The bed at the same angle. The sweater still folded on the chair. The television remote beside the box of tissues. The photograph on the dresser, slightly crooked. Someone had straightened it once, he was sure. Maybe more than once. That was care too. A hand adjusting a frame. A hand pulling the blanket up. A hand writing down a nurse's name so nobody would forget who had been kind. He let his palm rest again on the cooler. The old fabric had warmed completely now. It was no longer just an object from work, no longer only a thing carried from station to station. It had become a small proof of ordinary effort moving through years. People had tried to love each other in the ways they knew. With food. With calls. With rides. With reminders. With a light left on. With a receipt kept too long, because sometimes paper feels like evidence that somebody was there, paying attention, making the day possible. The room softened around that thought. Not brighter. Just softer. He still did not pick up the phone. The message could wait another minute. The night was not asking him to solve anything. The keys could stay where they were. The receipt could remain in his hand. The old lunch cooler could sit beside the small table, holding more than it had been made to hold. And he could sit near it, quietly, while the past became gentle enough to stay. After a while, he lifted the phone. The message was short. His aunt's voice came through smaller than he expected, a little tired, a little careful. She said she had forgotten to mention the blue sweater. She said it might be in the second drawer, unless somebody had taken it home to wash. Then she paused, as if the rest of what she meant could not fit into a message. He listened until the line went silent. Then he set the phone down again. The room seemed to hear it too. The lamp held its small circle of light. The keys stayed where they were. The receipt lay flat now, no longer curled around his fingers. The old lunch cooler rested against the table leg, quiet as a closed door. He thought about the blue sweater. Not because it mattered much by itself. It was probably in the drawer. Or in a laundry bag. Or folded somewhere by a nurse who had too many things to keep track of and still tried to place each thing where it belonged. But the sweater brought back the room again. The nursing home room with its soft beige walls, its television mounted a little too high, its curtain half open to the last of the day. The chair beside the bed. The water cup with the bendable straw. The box of tissues turned sideways. The family photos arranged as if they were holding a place that words could not hold anymore. He had stood there earlier, not knowing where to put his hands. That happens sometimes in rooms like that. You arrive with concern, with history, with updates from the family, with questions you mean to ask. Then the room becomes very ordinary. A blanket needs pulling up. A cup needs moving closer. The sweater is not where someone thought it was. A nurse steps in and smiles. A cart rolls by in the hallway. Life keeps asking for small movements. So he had done what he could. He had straightened the photograph. He had checked the drawer. He had listened to the quiet breathing in the room, to the hallway sounds beyond the door, to the soft squeak of someone's shoes passing outside. Nothing had been solved. Still, something had been tended. Now, in his own room, he looked at the old cooler and understood it beside those other things. The sweater. The receipt. The key. The phone. All the small objects that gather around care because care needs somewhere to land. Care is often too tired for ceremony. It comes as a lunch packed before dawn. It comes as a call made from a parking lot. It comes as someone asking about a sweater because they cannot fix the larger ache, but they can remember what keeps another person warm. He sat back. The night outside had gone fully dark. A car moved along the street, and its headlights crossed the wall for a second before leaving. The room returned to itself. The soft edge of the table. The lampshade. The worn place on the chair. The cooler by his knee. He let the quiet stay. For years, he had thought of gratitude as something that arrived clearly, almost like a sentence. Thank you for this. Thank you for that. Something with a name, a direction, a person standing close enough to hear it. But tonight it was smaller. It was not a sentence. It was not even a full thought. It was the warmth that came when he remembered hands making ordinary days possible. It was the feeling of being sent out into the morning with food. It was the feeling of being expected home. It was the memory of people trying, sometimes clumsily, sometimes beautifully, mostly quietly. The cooler did not ask anything from him. It only stayed there. And maybe that was why he could feel it. The long day had reached its edge. The calls had slowed. The nursing home parking lot had faded into the dark behind him. The room had stopped sharpening every detail. He picked up the receipt one last time and folded it along the crease it already had. Then he placed it beside the keys. Not because he needed it. Because for one more night, it belonged there. The old lunch cooler stayed under the table, close to his feet, holding no food now, no ice pack, no note, no careful sandwich wrapped for a long shift. Still, it seemed full in the dim room. Full of mornings. Full of hands. Full of the ordinary ways people had tried to love and be loved before the day ran out of light. He sat with that. A little gratitude at the edge of the day. Near the end of the night, he left the receipt beside the keys and let the phone stay quiet. The room did not need more light. The lamp was enough. The old lunch cooler rested close to his shoes, its worn handle turned toward the table like something that had come home too. He thought of the nursing home parking lot, the dusk on the cars, the blue sweater someone still remembered. He thought of early kitchens, tired hands, paper napkins folded around ordinary food. Nothing in the room became easy. But it became less lonely. For a while, he stayed there without reaching for anything. The past was not asking to be fixed. It was only sitting nearby, softer now, with its small proofs of care. And the day, almost finished, still held a little warmth.